Hi Year 7, it's Miss Singleton here and I'm going to be talking you through Gothic writing today, and it's all linked in with the work that you've been doing in your short stories booklet. So, today our learning objectives are to establish the features of Gothic writing, to look at some examples of Gothic writing, to complete a piece of writing including some of those Gothic conventions, and to think about how we can create tension and suspense in our writing. Okay, so task 1 is really straightforward. I've written a very simple sentence there describing a sort of scary scene. So I've said, I walked into a dark room. It smelt bad. I saw a shadow in the corner. I screamed. And what I want you to do is pause the video in a second and complete the task just down the left-hand side of the screen. So I want you to think of a better word for dark, bad and screamed. I want you to add a little bit more detail by describing the surroundings to create a little bit more suspense. So for example, you might want to describe the dark room in more detail. I then want you to try and add in at least 2 language features to create tension. So you might want to add a simile or an onomatopoeia in there just to make your writing seem a little bit more tense. And if you want to push yourself, I want you to have a go at using a metaphor to foreshadow death. So in essence, I want you to put a metaphor in there that could suggest the character speaking is about to die. So pause here and have a go at those tasks, please. Okay, fantastic. So, for us to understand Gothic writing, I think we need to understand first what feeling scared is, as that's a big part of Gothic writing. So we need to think about what fear is and what it's like when we feel fear. So I want you to answer those questions just below on the left-hand side of the screen again. I want you to answer for me. When was the last time you felt scared? Why did you feel scared? So explain what it was that frightened you. What does being scared feel like? And I want you to write 2 sentences to describe that. So for me, when I'm scared, I get sweaty palms and shaky hands and I'm really agitated. I can't sit still. But that might be different for everyone else. And then as a challenge, I want you to think about what language features you could use to create fear and suspense in your writing. So for example, an onomatopoeia might be a good one. You might use words like crack and creak, something that sort of makes you imagine somebody creeping around. Okay, so pause here and answer those questions for me. Okay, hopefully you've done that now and you've been sort of forced to think about what being scared is and how it makes you feel. And that's really important because in the Gothic genre, fear and sort of scared emotions is really common. So what I want you to do while I talk you through this, I'm going to explain in a bit more detail what Gothic literature is and what it's about. So as I'm talking you through this, I'd like you to summarise the information that I'm going to talk through in your own words. So, Gothic literature has a really long history dating back to the 18th century, so sort of 1740s onwards. It's called a subgenre of fiction literature because it's a combination of horror and romance, so it doesn't fit into one genre, so we call that a subgenre. Gothic literature focuses on the supernatural, so things like ghosts and monsters and zombies, things that we can't always prove are real, things that we don't know a lot about that make us feel scared. Now, there's a lot of history behind this, and it's sort of formed because of a clash between things that were happening at the time and people's beliefs. So during the formation of sort of Gothic books, there was something called the Romantic movement, which was a movement in literature sort of about nature and the imagination and sort of the rejection of logic and things that make sense. So the Romantics believed that logic and reason wasn't important because in the world there are some things that just can't be explained. And they also believed in sort of the power of nature, and often that would inspire their writing. So they often included natural settings in their work, okay? But this was sort of clashing with the movements at the time. So in the 18th century, there was lots of scientific discovery and invention. So people were making huge advances in medicine, in mechanics, and in sort of exploring the world and learning more about new things. And that led to the Industrial Revolution, which was sort of the huge boom in industry. Lots more companies were being formed. People, because they had machines, could make hundreds of products really quickly. So the time that the Romantics were working was very much grounded in logic and reason and sort of money-making things. And the Romantic movement rejected that. They said, we don't like this new focus on money and industry. We want to stay with nature and the natural world and the importance of it, because we're losing it. So that's sort of how Gothic was formed, because it's a bit of a blend of both. You've got links to sort of science and invention, but you've also got links to nature and supernatural things. And finally, Horace Walpole is rumoured to have been one of the first writers of the Gothic novel. So he wrote a story called The Castle of Otranto. And that's sort of where we get a lot of the conventions of Gothic work. So a castle is a really famous example of that, of sort of a typical setting for a Gothic story. So hopefully you've got that down. If you need a little bit more time, please do pause here and add to your notes. If not, I'm going to just move straight on. So I can't play this on here for copyright reasons, but I want you just to open the PowerPoint that you've received, and I want you to watch this clip, okay? On that clip, it explains to you lots of conventions of Gothic literature, which basically means typical techniques and ideas that we find in Gothic stories. So, for example, the setting being a castle or a prison or somewhere spooky is quite common, okay? That's going to take you about 5 or 6 minutes. So I need you to pause the video here, open up the PowerPoint and play this clip and write those notes down for me. Okay, now that is really important because we need to understand the things we often find in Gothic stories if we're going to have a go at writing our own. And that takes me really nicely onto some examples of Gothic literature. So some of these you will have heard of. Dracula, we've got the vampire that is causing havoc in Victorian London. We've got The Fall of the House of Usher, which is sort of a really spooky, ghostly story about a scary house that collapses on itself in the end. We've got Frankenstein, which is about a scientific inventor who manages to repurpose human body parts and create a monster. And we've got other things sort of like Jekyll and Hyde and Wuthering Heights that might have a little bit more romance in there as well. So Gothic literature can be really broad, and what I like about it is that it can be really creative. You've got the opportunity to create something really crazy, which you don't always have in other genres of literature. So, just so you can get a bit of a better idea of what happens in a typical Gothic story, I want you to watch this second clip, and it's basically a summary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, okay? Again, I'm not going to play it on here on the video because I can't, but if you open the PowerPoint, you'll find this video there, and I want you to answer the questions on the left-hand side for me. So as you're watching, I want you to tell me what the story's about, what conventions of Gothic literature are used by the writer, and I want you to think about how the writer builds tension throughout the story. So as you're watching, you're sort of thinking about, how do we know this story's Gothic? What does the writer do to tell us that the story's a Gothic piece of literature? Okay, so pause here and have a go at that. Okay, so after all that, we've got an idea of what Gothic literature is, what sort of things we can expect from Gothic stories. So I've created, in essence, a little recipe that if you follow, you can't go wrong. So we've got setting. Often it's a bleak or remote location, something like a castle, a forest, a cemetery. It's something that's quite isolated and that can be quite famous for hauntings and supernatural events. So when you've picked your setting, you need to choose a character. Now that character is often someone in either physical or psychological torment. So maybe they're lonely, maybe they've just lost a loved one, maybe they've got some sort of illness so they're quite weak and vulnerable. Or it can be a character that's just quite restless and looking for change. So maybe a person who's leaving the city and moving into the countryside or something like that. So once you've got your setting and your character, you then need to think about your plot. Now, often the plot will have violence in it. It can be quite ghoulish, so it can be a little bit dark and deathly, and it can have links to the supernatural. And it always has to build tension. So as you're sort of reading through the story, the writer won't give very much away until the end. Sort of we're building up to finding out what's going to happen, to sort of the height of the tension and the drama. Okay. So once you've thought of your plot, you then need to think about how you're going to bring the supernatural in, because that's really important. So you could bring in a ghost or a spirit, a zombie, someone undead, a monster, and that's just to name a few. You can also have things like witches and wizards and sort of people who predict the future, stuff like that. Anything that we can't really explain that's classed as supernatural, you can include, okay? And if you can include each of those things in your story, you're guaranteed to have a super spooky Gothic story, okay? So, this all leads me on to your final task. So you've got a choice. You can either write your own Gothic story, okay? You'll see on there I've got some sentence starters. I've included the 4 aspects that you need to consider when you're planning. I've got some sophisticated words for you to use at the bottom, and I've got language features there. So what we're thinking about in particular is how we can use these different features to make our writing more Gothic. So for example, you might use pathetic fallacy. We might make the start of the story really stormy and rainy to foreshadow the danger that the main character's going to be in. Or for example, we might use a simile to compare the castle to a graveyard, so it sounds spooky and ominous and like something evil might be lurking, okay? So if you want to write your own Gothic story, you need to pause here. Okay, if you are not writing your own and you think you'll struggle with that, attached to your email this morning, I've also sent a story called The Backpacker. Now that story is incomplete. So if you would prefer, you can instead read the story that's been sent out and you can finish it. You can write your own ending, okay? So if you want to do that, that's fine, but you still need to be thinking about those conventions of Gothic literature. So things like the setting, your character, the plot, and the supernatural, okay? Now that story centres around a man who goes backpacking in Russia and sort of finds some ominous things when he's there. And you can interpret that however you want and write the ending however you want, as long as you can argue that it's Gothic, okay? And if you want to do that, you need to pause here and have a go. Okay, before I go, I just want to check that you have made sure to include those 4 key aspects of Gothic literature, so setting, character, plot and supernatural elements. I want you to check that you've written a substantial amount, so I think in the email I will have said 3 paragraphs minimum. But you're obviously free to write more than that. I should be able to see some examples of language features that you've used in the story, so I should be able to see maybe a pattern of 3 or an onomatopoeia or personification. And I should also see some of those spooky words in your story, the sophisticated ones listed on the screen. Once you have finished that, Year 7, that is everything for today. So well done, keep up the hard work, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye.